Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching The Freedom Side. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It's always great to be alongside you, Eugene. Happy Thursday.
Happy Thursday to you as well. Big shout out to everybody who is watching this show. Big shout out to everyone watching on Free Speech TV, as well as everyone who is watching on YouTube. If you are on YouTube, I would just remind you that it would be a great time right now to go ahead and hit the subscribe button, then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to, including dispatches from Rania Khalek, of which there have been a number of excellent live episodes recently, in addition to her normal episodes, but something to go check after this show is over in our live tab on YouTube. Rania, other things you would like to inform our viewers about?
Yeah, just to point out real quick, a lot of my episodes have been live recently because I worry that if they're not live, by the time they go up, the situation will have dramatically changed because Israel is forcing us to wake up to a new horror show every day full of new atrocities that are hard to keep up with. All that said, Eugene, yes, for those who appreciate breakthrough news, appreciate independent media that is telling you the truth about the current genocide taking place in Gaza and spreading into Lebanon, you can help support our journalism here by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month, where you can access exclusive content as well as very cool merch. Like, I believe Eugene probably has the mug. Show him that mug, Eugene. Very beautiful, beautiful mug. Mine is at my studio in Lebanon, which I'm away from right now. I'm just going to be making quips about that throughout the show. But all that's to say, I think independent media is more important than ever right now, especially as we see the entire mainstream corporate media apparatus just throw a tsunami of genocidal lies at us every single day. So one way that you can help be a part of the anti-genocide movement is supporting the independent media outlets that are bringing you the truth. So do consider becoming a member.
Yes, absolutely. It would be greatly, greatly appreciated. And shout out to our existing patrons who are out there viewing this right now. All of your, sacrifice there, and I know that for a lot of people it really is a sacrifice to support us, is greatly appreciated and has gone a long way to pushing us forward in this absolutely critical moment. So yes, anyone who donates in any way, shape, or form, we'd be happy to have you, but the recurring monthly donations make it easier to plan and thus make it easier to do more and to expand and do different, bring you different coverage from different places in different types of ways, and just continue to grow our brand. Rania, you're right, it's a critical moment for the media in every possible way. So we're about to jump right into it here, but of course this would also be a good time as we start the show off for you to let anyone know that who you think might like this, that we are here and we are getting ready to go forward. So whether you're knocking on people's doors using air horns, sending carrier pigeons, talking to the person sitting next to you on a train, or whatever you may be doing, now is the time. Now is the time to let them know we are here on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News. But Rania, you mentioned just a little bit ago the importance of independent journalism, the failures of the mainstream media. And I think one other crucial aspect of that whole conversation is what we're seeing in terms of the crackdown on journalists who are actually doing a very good job of covering what's happening in Palestine and in West Asia more broadly, and also in the social movements in solidarity with the Palestinian people around the world, especially in the United Kingdom. Significant crackdowns. Most recently, Asa Winstanley of the Electronic Intifada had his home raided by the police there on what at least seemed to me to be highly spurious charges, allegedly something, terrorism, I believe is what it is. But to get into all the different pieces of this, unbelievable attack on journalism there in the UK and on the Electronic Intifada, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show once again by Ali Abu Nima, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada. Ali, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.
I just want to ask first, maybe for those who have not seen what took place to Asa Winstanley from your outlet, the criminalization of his journalistic work, what took place there, and what do you think some of the reasons behind it and implications for it could be?
Well, what happened last Thursday, October 17th, so just a week ago at 5:40 in the morning, 10 police officers from the Metropolitan Police came to the home of Asa Winstanley in North London. They banged on the door and made him open it, and they took control of his house, and they presented him with 2 warrants, one to search his home and one to search his vehicle, and authorizing them to seize any electronic devices or documents or notes that he uses specifically for his journalism. And the pretext for this raid is suspicion or an investigation that he has made social media posts that violate the Terrorism Acts in the UK. You have the Terrorism Act 2000 and the Terrorism Act 2006, which make it an offense to, in the words of the law, invite support for terrorism. And we have to be very clear what this means. The first thing is that these laws in the UK would be completely unconstitutional in the United States. They involve purely so-called speech crimes, simply stating an opinion. For example, if you say that Palestinians have a right to resist Israel through armed struggle, that could be considered a crime under the Terrorism Act. Now, I should be clear that when the police raided Asa's home, they didn't specify which social media posts they claim to be investigating, and they haven't arrested him or charged him with any crime, but they have seized his devices.
And Ali, this comes in sort of a pattern, right? Asa's not the first person this has happened to, though he may be the first journalist. You can correct me on that. This has happened to in the UK. But I also am wondering if you can connect this to the general attack on journalists that we've seen throughout this genocide by the Israelis. They have killed almost 100, I think it's 180 journalists at this point. They're nearing 200 journalists in Gaza alone. They've killed, I think, 3 in Lebanon at this point, though that may expand as we see their atrocities in Lebanon expand. And then just yesterday, we saw the Israeli military put out what looked like a hit list of the remaining Al Jazeera journalists operating in Gaza with their photos and accusing them of being members of Hamas, essentially telling the world we are going to murder these people. They've already murdered so many journalists. They specifically have a vendetta against Al Jazeera. So I'm curious if you could put what happened to Asa in the context of this broader attack on those trying to reveal the reality of what's taking place against those Israel's exterminating.
Yeah, what's happening to Asa and other journalists is extremely serious in the UK and in the West. And I want to come back to that because it's directly linked to this genocide. But you're right, there is no comparison with what Israel is doing, which is openly murdering journalists. And this hit list they put out yesterday is extremely worrying because unless there is a major international outcry, Israel may well go ahead and murder these journalists. And I hate to even say it. I hate to even speak the words. But we've seen enough of what Israel is willing to do to think that's the case. And I think what ties these situations together is, of course, the genocide, but it's also the silence of so-called mainstream media. There's been little to no solidarity for the journalists in Gaza, much less for journalists like Asa. And Asa is not the first journalist to be targeted in this way in the UK. In recent months, we've seen Kit Clarenberg, who writes for the Grey Zone and has also written for the Electronic Intifada, who was subjected to this kind of intrusive search of his devices when he was flying into the UK. The freelance journalist Richard Medhurst was arrested under the Terrorism Act and had his devices seized a few weeks ago, in August, in fact, on returning to the UK through Heathrow Airport. And we've seen other high-profile activists and writers like Mick Napier of the the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Tony Greenstein, another well-known author, writes for the Electronic Intifada, an activist in Palestine solidarity groups, arrested also for making statements that say they support the right of the Palestinians to resist. Statements that are simply, that Palestinians have a right to resist is enshrined in international law. And how can it be a crime to say that? But the British authorities are arresting people for that. And Sarah Wilkinson, another high-profile activist, who's also had her home raided by police early in the morning, her devices seized, and she was arrested. As I said, Asa hasn't been arrested. That could happen. What ties all these people together is that they have all been in the forefront of journalism and activism against this British-backed Israeli genocide in Gaza. And Asa is a particularly prominent journalist in this case. People who read the Electronic Intifada, watch our live stream, know his work very well. His most recent article before the arrest was about how Israel killed hundreds of its own people on October 7th, a story we've been covering for a year at the Electronic Intifada. But he brought all that information, including some new information, together in this really fantastic investigative article just days before his home was raided and his equipment was seized. And so I don't think any of that is a coincidence. One thing I will say in terms of the response, the National Union of Journalists in the UK, of which Asa is a member, came out with a very strong statement and are supporting him. We at the Electronic Intifada are also supporting him, of course. Asa has a very strong legal team in the UK, and they are pushing back against this very hard. And we, as the Electronic Intifada, have also engaged our own legal counsel in the UK, and we will be doing whatever it takes to prevent British authorities from accessing these devices as a matter of principle. This is journalistic material. It involves sources. It involves information we use in our journalism, and journalists should not have to live in fear of police banging down their doors at 6 a.m. just because they're doing journalism. It's an outrage. And all of this is happening in the context of Western countries which claim to be the paragons of democracy and human rights and free speech, and they are behaving like dictatorial thugs. And we will certainly not be intimidated by it.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the Hannibal Directive reporting that's been done, because it just feels like the impact of this in terms of, people's own consciousness is also so huge. I mean, so much of, I think, what has happened over the past 12 months, for those of us who knew about Palestine for so long, maybe some of this isn't terribly surprising, but I think for millions of people around the world to learn about these things, to be able to get, relatively unfiltered media, obviously social media is its own filter, but the importance of journalists like Asa and others of bringing these things to the forefront in a way that maybe you couldn't in the past, in the pre-social media era, at such a scale that, to the extent these attacks are allowed to continue and are not pushed back on, it really has a big impact of how people in the world can have the information they need to act in a way that is just.
Well, this story about the Hannibal Directive, Israel's military doctrine that allows it to kill its own people rather than allowing them to be taken captive. Most of our reporting on this, including Asa's reporting, is sourced from Israeli sources, including Israeli media. It's open knowledge there, but it's totally absent in Western media. You will barely find any reference to the Hannibal Directive. The other major story that we debunked is the October 7 rape story. There is still to this day no evidence of a single rape on October 7, 2023 by Palestinian fighters, let alone the mass rapes Israel claims. But what do you notice? All of these fake claims are still integral to the narratives, the official narratives of Western governments. We all saw Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, Justin Trudeau, and all the other Western leaders parroting these same lies just a few days ago after Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed. And so these lies are central to their narratives and their policies. And they can count on the BBC and the CBC and CNN and the Washington Post and the New York Times not to challenge the lies, but to further the lies and to spread the lies, which is exactly what they've been doing. So it is left to independent media like the Electronic Intifada, like Breakthrough News, like a few other outlets to bust it. And the fact is, we have busted these lies. We have exposed these lies incredibly effectively over the last year. I have to say, more effectively than I thought we would be able to, in terms of just the reach and the knowledge and the fact that people don't buy the lies anymore. And that's why they have to come after us, to try to discredit us, whether it's, we've seen in recent months, painting other independent media outlets claiming that they're Russian agents or Iranian agents, or somehow claiming that they're involved in misinformation, or now trying to tarnish the stellar reputation of a journalist like Asa Winstanley with a so-called investigation under this completely bogus terrorism act, which wouldn't even fly in the United States is no paragon of free speech. We know that there is censorship in the United States, but it's done through universities, it's done through social media companies, it's done through self-censorship, it's done through people losing their jobs, but it's not done yet by the police beating down the doors of journalists at 5 a.m. And so it's up to all of us to defend the freedoms we have. And whether it's in the UK or in France or in Germany or in the United States, in all of these countries that are part of the imperial core, they are finding that the official narratives are not sticking anymore. People aren't buying them. So they're having to take the velvet glove off of the iron fist. And we all have to stand up for each other in this setting, because we don't know who's going to be next.
Yeah, that's a really important point right there, Ali. It's today it's Asa, tomorrow it's one of us, and then on and on and on. But I think there's something I want you to touch on here before we wrap, and that is specifically to the issue of the way they're using this terrorism law and the way they're going after people who are essentially supporting what you said is enshrined in international law. They're saying Palestinians do in fact have a right to armed resistance. They do, against occupation, against colonialism. And when we talk about groups that are at the forefront of that armed resistance, groups like Hamas or in Lebanon, Hezbollah, these are organizations who've been classified as terrorist organizations by a minority of the world. Just because the US says this is a terrorist organization and European countries agree and Israel agrees, that is a small segment of the world. A larger segment of the world, the vast majority of the world actually views these organizations as representatives of segments of the Palestinian population, as a segment of the Lebanese population, and they don't treat them or classify them as terrorist organizations. So I'm just curious if you could speak to the fact that this is a classification based purely on the viewpoint of a minority of ruthless colonial countries that are trying to essentially make it fringe again, because it did used to be fringe. I don't think it is anymore. They're trying to make it fringe and make people feel like they shouldn't ever support what is literally enshrined in international law, which is that people who are dealing with invaders and occupiers absolutely have a right to violently resist that.
Yeah, and these designations of Hamas or other groups as terrorists are made by executive decree. Some government bureaucrat says this is the list of terrorist organizations, and now we can throw you in prison for life if you say the wrong thing or you do something that we interpret as supporting these groups. And these are terror tactics by the government to terrorize people into not supporting the legitimate right of an occupied people to resist, or to demonize a people. We've seen how Israeli propaganda is there's no difference between Hamas and the Palestinian people. The Israeli president said right at the beginning of this, Isaac Herzog, there is no civilian population in Gaza. So we have to understand the demonization of these groups as being about demonizing the whole Palestinian people and about facilitating and justifying the genocide, which is being supported by Canada, Germany, France, Britain, Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, John Fetterman, etc., by the Democratic Party, by the Republican Party too, although they're not the government right now. So that's what these things are designed to do. And I think the sea change that has happened in the last year is that people are no longer as afraid as they used to be to speak out and say, we support the right to resist. We support the Palestinian people. We see that Israel is a genocidal, barbaric entity and should be fought against, should be resisted. And so they're trying to turn back the clock by terrorizing people into silence and by escalating these use of these counter-terror laws. And by the way, in the case of the specific terrorism laws that they cited in the search of Asa Winstanley's home, back when these laws were first passed in the early 2000s, Human Rights Watch, a liberal mainstream human rights group, said these specific provisions should be repealed because they are so broad that they could be used to infringe on basic free speech rights. And that is exactly how they have been used and are being used. That Human Rights Watch predicted the situation exactly right.
Mm. Well, Ali, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here to help sort through it all. Ali Abunimah, director of the Electronic Intifada. Thank you so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Rania?
Wow, Eugene. I mean, it's really important people continue to follow this because this is like that sort of creeping terror tactic, as he called it. I appreciate that he called it a terror tactic. It is meant to terrorize. And yes, we are in the U.S. where we do have stronger free speech laws, but,
yeah, and it's connected too. I mean, to be honest with you, like when you look at how a lot of this is happening with the crackdowns on different groups and different organizations happening across the Five Eyes countries right now, the laws are different, and I don't have any knowledge of this, but it just appears to me, Rania, from open source information, that there's coordination happening between the U.S., Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and probably other countries around how they're trying to crack down on this speech. And the UK, because the laws there are so ridiculous, is becoming, maybe the forefront of it. And, the director, one of the heads of Palestine Action also has been, I believe, charged, but at least, is being attacked for a speech that he gave in a similar sort of space. You've seen people who've been arrested for like T-shirts they were wearing at different points. You've seen people accosted on the street by the police in the UK for wearing keffiyehs. So, it's a rampant runaway thing. But if we don't think that these things can happen, and obviously we know, Rania, and we move on after this, that there are significant calls from very powerful people in the United States to have a more UK-based attitude towards how we treat the issue specifically of Palestine. And we've seen a lot of these individuals very, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Bill Ackman, all these, billionaires of all sorts, all saying the people should be stripped of their nonprofit status and IRS, that media organizations shouldn't be allowed to operate because they're really secretly this, that, and the third. So, it can happen here. And of course, we have the precedent of Julian Assange. They went to the ends of the earth to crush him. So there's obviously, I think Ali made the point very correctly. It's clear that more and more people don't buy the official line on Palestine and, quite frankly, just about everything else in the United States and around the various imperialist countries.
I mean, how could you?
Yeah.
Like,
so they're trying to just shut it down.
Yeah.
Trying to shut it down.
No, this is that's like historically what they resort to when they lose control over the narrative. And while they still have control over the narrative in certain quarters, they've lost it in others. Like online, they've lost control of the narrative because people are like, no. I'm seeing mutilated babies and things that look like the Holocaust, and people absolutely need to fight that.
Yeah,
By any
people
means
aren't as stupid as
necessary.
they think they are, and they're now finding that out. Well, speaking of some of the points you just made there, and how this issue is playing in many different ways, as you noted to me, I like that you're keeping up with this. Kamala had the town hall on CNN last night. You were locked in, journalist that you are. There was a lot to that town hall. There's a lot of pieces to it, but there are two clips that I think stood out to you that I thought were very notable and that are getting a lot of run online, and rightfully so, because I mean, they're so ridiculous. And one of them actually was, she was asked directly, to some degree, not that they're asking good questions, but sort of about the issue of what's going on with this genocide, how she relates to it, how she's relating to voters. I don't want to sort of editorialize it too much because it really is quite the clip. But maybe we should just play that clip and then come back.
What do you say to voters who are thinking about supporting a third-party candidate or staying on the couch, not voting at all because of this issue?
Listen, I am not going to deny the strong feelings that people have. I don't know that anyone who has seen the images who would not have strong feelings about what has happened, much less those who have relatives who have died and been killed. And I know people and have talked with people. So I appreciate that. But I also do know that for many people who care about this issue, they also care about bringing down the price of groceries. They also care about our democracy and not having a president of the United States who admires dictators and is a fascist. They also care about the fact that we need practical, common sense solutions from a leader who is willing to work across the aisle on behalf of the American people and not themselves. They want a president who cares about a fundamental freedom to make decisions about your own body, understanding that we're not trying to change anyone's belief, but let's not have the government telling women what to do with their body.
Wow. So a couple things stand out to me, Eugene. She didn't say, yeah, what's happening is horrible and we should stop it. She said, the images are terrible. And I even know people and have talked to people who've had relatives killed, but don't you want cheaper groceries? Like, what? She can't even, it's all bullshit anyways. Excuse me. I don't usually curse on this show, but I can't help myself. It's all bullshit anyway. Like, they're not going to lower grocery prices. They're not going to do anything to protect our reproductive rights because they already did it under Joe Biden when they got taken away. And they've done nothing since then. Like, all of that list of things she's trying to blackmail us about, they're not good on anyway. But you couldn't even say, yeah, we should make this violence stop. Basically, she's saying, yeah, it's really bad and that sucks, but it's either you don't vote for us and then you don't get your groceries stay expensive, or you do vote for us and genocide keeps happening, but maybe you'll get cheaper groceries. Like, how little do you think of our lives? It's sick. It's sick. And it also just, I just feel like the Democratic Party, they hate all of us. And I'm not talking about us just like Arabs. I mean, they hate us. They hate the left. They hate progressives. They hate us. She is running around the country campaigning with Liz Cheney, trying to get Republicans to vote for her. She does not care about us. The Democratic Party does not care about us. They will never move towards the left. And she was explicitly asked, what do you say to people who care about this issue? And she essentially accused us all, in so many words, of being single issue voters. And if she loses and groceries get more expensive, it's our fault because we cared about genocide. I don't know, man. That was really aggravating to watch.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things that could be said. I mean, the first thing to me is it seems strange that the sort of through line is, as you're speaking to, an either or. It's not. I mean, it seems to me that ending the genocide in Gaza is a practical, common sense solution that the president should work across the aisle for in the interest of the American people and not themselves, right? Like that, there doesn't seem to be actually any contradiction in that thing. So it's creating a fake contradiction, or that somehow you can only bring down grocery prices if you continue the genocide in Gaza, which also doesn't make any sense. I mean, these are all things that are not, in fact, mutually exclusive whatsoever. You're only choosing to make them mutually exclusive because you want to back the Israeli, project to destroy the Palestinian people, ethnically cleanse them, take over the land, and install this ridiculous settler colony at a larger degree. So you've just decided to do it, but it's actually not, in fact, a contradiction. And I think that's an important factor. And we mentioned this on the show last week. I mean, it is true. The most successful settler colonies are the U.S., New Zealand, Australia, and we know what happened there. They just killed everybody, or almost everybody, and displaced as many as possible, and now hide the history of their own genocide, which hopefully we'll be able to talk about a little bit later in the show as regards Australia. But it's just a totally fake contradiction that is only existing because they want to do this thing, to back this genocide for their own political goals. And I think you are right, Rania. They don't. The Democrat leadership does hate the base of the Democrats because the base of the people who vote for the Democrats have moved beyond what the donors who control the Democratic Party are willing to do. I mean, that's the other factor you've seen from Kamala Harris is not only did she proclaim herself a capitalist, but she's been going out of her way, and there's quite a bit of reporting that has been done on this issue to court business leaders by saying that she will be more pro-business than Joe Biden. Now, remember, this is the same Joe Biden who said in 2020 to rich donors that his program, no matter what they thought about it, was one that means that nothing would fundamentally change. So it's not as if he's like some anti-business, radical socialist candidate, but she's actually going out of her way to court the cryptocurrency industry, to quote the biggest to court the biggest hedge funds, to court the individuals working around AI and these big tech companies. Uber is directly embedded in her campaign. Her brother-in-law, Tony West, who's the chief executive, is right there as one of her top advisors. They're promising to potentially fire people like Lena Khan and Gary Gensler at the SEC and the FTC, who businesses don't like. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, they want to support the genocide in Gaza, and they want to support the continued full-on offensive of the capitalist class against working class people in America. And they're very upset that the vast majority of Democrats would prefer to see them do something other than that. And I think that is an apt way to say it. They hate it. It angers them because they want you to just fall in line. And the final thing I'll just say on this, before we move on, I think there's one more clip we want to play. The point you make about grocery prices is actually extremely key because people don't really understand what's happening here. They're saying we're going to bring down grocery prices. It's important for people to understand here that Kamala's plan to bring down grocery prices is not to actually have a cap on prices. It's to pass a new law, which would have to, of course, get through both houses of Congress, and, who knows what could happen there, to pass a new law that would make it possible for the FTC to investigate individual companies, and then after the investigation, potentially take the company to court, and then maybe if the court rules that the FTC is right, say that the prices were too high. So it's like you paid way too much money for eggs, milk, chicken, bread this month, and maybe the price will be different in 5 years after the end of a court case. That is essentially her plan. There's maybe some other elements around it. If there's a hurricane or something, maybe you could cap prices. But by and large, it's basically just a bunch of individual lawsuits that'll take 8 years, and it would have to be a law that would have to pass a Congress that almost certainly would never pass such a law. So it's even to set that up, it's she said we're going to do long-term care covered by Medicare. Well, great. Why didn't we do that 60 years ago? But this was a proposal you already proposed, and it couldn't pass Congress when Democrats control both houses. So why should anyone believe if they elect you, and say, yes, okay, lesser of two evils, that you'll do it? And it's just so sinister because that context is always left out, and the media does nothing to bring it into the forefront.
Yeah, and then it just goes to the trajectory of the Democratic Party, which is to the right. And I think the next clip we have really demonstrates that. Can we play the second clip?
Well, let's talk about Donald Trump and that border wall. So remember, Donald Trump said Mexico would pay for it? Come on, they didn't. How much of that wall did he build? I think the last number I saw was about 2%. And then when it came time for him to do a photo op, you know where he did it? In the part of the wall that President Obama built.
But you're
So that's her problem with the border wall. Not that I thought the border wall was this horrible fascist thing that Trump was going to build that wall, right? Build the wall. And we have to vote against Trump and vote for Democrats because otherwise he's going to build a wall. but she doesn't seem opposed to it. She just expressed her opposition to the fact that Trump didn't actually build the wall. He only built 2% of the wall he wanted to build, and then credits Obama. It's Obama's wall, actually, which she's not wrong. Obama was building that wall. But it's just incredible. It speaks to that right-wing trajectory of the Democratic Party. And the other thing about the issue of the fact that on everything, there's not one issue I can think of where there's anything even remotely progressive sounding. Like, she's just a Republican. And then she called Trump a fascist in the earlier clip we showed. Okay, but what are you guys? You think Trump's fascist? Your policies are not that different from his. Honestly, they're really not. I mean, I know he does definitely, incite fascistic sentiments. I'm not going to deny that in the country. But as far as the rest of the world goes, you're talking about that genocide in Gaza. You support Israeli fascism, and you support the use of fascism against the rest of the world. So you want me to be in a world where none of the rest of the world matters? Just maybe potentially 5 years from now, a lower grocery price. And I have to just be okay with mass slaughter constantly everywhere else, including the bombing of hospitals. I don't want to live in a world like that. I can't. That's the most American supremacist thing imaginable.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that you're making a very good point. And the context of the fascism thing, by the way, is that John Kelly, the former, was he national security advisor for Trump or whatever he was, or chief of staff, one of them, came out and said Trump is basically a fascist. I mean, this is a guy who led a military unit in the U.S. war in Iraq. I mean, I don't know what the final numbers are, Rania. I mean, some people say over 1 million people died. I don't know. But, huge numbers of people killed, a country completely and totally destroyed. And it's so this guy is now whether you think Trump is a fascist or not, just the fact that it's Dick Cheney, John Kelly, it's all these people who have committed some of the greatest crimes against people ever, in terms of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sanctions and other things like that. That's who these people are. And somehow they're our moral compass. It doesn't mean that Trump is good, but it just where are you at? Where the people with some of the most immoral policies, and a lot of them not long in the past, not that long ago, are somehow now considered the sort of moral paragon and virtue. And then again, to your point, just going further and further to the right. And it's worth noting too that it was really Bill Clinton who brought back the idea of extreme sort of tough on the border policies. I mean, it's a complicated issue. I mean, obviously Reagan wasn't really great on it either, nor was Bush. But, the civil rights movement helped make a big change in 1965 to immigration laws to lift a period that had been intensely anti-immigrant from pretty much every part of the world, going back to the 1920s. Then in the 80s, there was the Reagan legalization of a number of people who were here. They didn't really want to do it, but you still had a more of a pro-immigrant sentiment. And Bill Clinton, in the context of being tough on crime, he singled out the death penalty and being tough on the death penalty, and of course left the campaign trail to execute Ricky Ray Rector, who was developmentally disabled. He identified sort of quote unquote crime in the streets, and had the Sister Soldier moment and all those. But the other thing he heavily targeted is we were going to be tough on the border. And when he came in, they adopted a policy that was 100% openly written down, designed to kill people by driving them into the most dangerous areas to cross so that they would die in the desert. And it's just an unbelievable factor, and it's been terrible since then. But I think you're right. I mean, this is the long-term drift of this sort of, Democratic Leadership Council, they used to call themselves in Clinton's days, these people who are essentially Republicans, I guess you could say. I mean, however we want to frame that, right-wing, center-right people, but who are pretending to be something that is better.
And I want to add something to all that you're saying, because I think my view on this has evolved because I've lived abroad for so many years. I've lived in Lebanon for so many years, which is the country I'm also Lebanese. And I mean, when we talk about a fascist being in charge of America and what that means for the American population, I recognize, I have family in the US. I want them to live in the safest context possible here. I don't want fascism in America. But I really struggle with the idea of I'm supposed to care about Kamala versus Trump. And I care about the slight nuances, I suppose, and what it means for the level of suffering of people in America. But I also live in Lebanon, where Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have inflicted on my country of Lebanon horrible atrocities. I don't know what else to call them other than an attack, like a fascist attack from a ethnocentric, religious, fascist country funded and armed by the US, while the US is constantly trying to put fascists in charge of Lebanon. Like, if the people the US wants to be in charge of Lebanon were to actually take over the country, normalize with Israel, and institute the sort of style of government that they want in Lebanon, I wouldn't be able to live there because they would kill me. Because that's what they've done in the past. The people the US want to put in charge of in Lebanon have actually kidnapped and disappeared and tortured members of my family in Lebanon. So I don't know what fascism means in that context. Like, why is it okay for the rest of the world to live in this horrific way where they're under the rule and the thumb of American mobster fascism? But then there's this weird conversation in the US among really privileged people talking about, yeah, but like under Kamala Harris, maybe we can get reproductive rights back. And maybe there might be lower grocery prices in 5 years. And that's why you, as an Arab whose family's being bombed right now, should be ashamed if you don't vote for her. I'm just like, what is this crap? Sorry, now I'm just on an angry rant, but like, I don't know how to have those two things in my head at the same time. It just doesn't make sense.
Well, listen, this is why people should continue to follow Breakthrough News so we can keep talking about all of these important issues and sort through it all. Shout out to Alex for your donation. We're going to turn here to another person in the race. That's Donald Trump. Also bad. And, I think that there is, though, because there's so much dissatisfaction amongst a lot of people with the state of affairs in America, who, maybe don't like everything he's saying, but see, maybe could switch things up, especially for working class people. Well, we're going to get into that now. Walter Smolarek, editor of Liberation News, is with us to get into all of this. Walter, thanks so much for being with us. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, dear. He's been silenced.
I am sorry. Is my audio on now?
You're back. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. Walter, there's a sort of, you see it, in the media, all these different things that, Trump's a more pro-worker candidate. He's speaking to the working class people are moving away from Democrats to Republicans and blah, blah, blah. And, beyond all the sort of polling and all those other issues, I just feel like there's such a cognitive dissonance that like, people are saying Trump is pro-worker. He's saying I'm pro-worker, but then like his number one fan seems to be Elon Musk, like the richest guy on earth, who's like kind of notoriously anti-worker. I mean, maybe just give us some of your initial thoughts about this framing around Trump as some sort of leader of the working class.
Yeah, for sure. Well, certainly it's wrong, right? I mean, Donald Trump is a billionaire. Billionaires look out for themselves first and foremost, but also for the interests of other billionaires and ultra rich people. In office, his record was 100% pro-rich, right? I mean, his biggest signature accomplishment, which he talks about all the time, are the tax cuts that gave $2 trillion. It was a $2 trillion tax cut to the rich and to the corporations that rich people own. So it's a false premise. But at the same time, you have to have a little bit of sympathy for people who are so desperate for something different, like anything that's a break from the past 4 years of like no assistance for the working class and just devastating inflation, that somebody, who sounds different, postures as an outsider like Donald Trump, he's able to get a significant amount of support, and he's willing to actually make, a direct appeal to the working class, which other Republican politicians have actually not. Like, I lived in Philadelphia for a long time. I was there about a week ago. And, they have these giant Trump billboards all along the highway, and it says Trump for the workers. So, it's understandable on the one hand why people are frustrated, maybe a little confused. But if you look at Trump's actual record, he has absolutely nothing to offer for working people. And his loyalty is 100% with the rich and with Wall Street.
Yeah, but Walter, I mean, he did work at McDonald's a few days ago. I mean, did you not see that? But what's so amazing is that I think he was asked by somebody, do you think that we should raise the minimum wage now that you've done this? And he like totally sidestepped the question. But all that's to say, I do think that I did see this clip of Obama where God, and Obama's so lectury. And he was like, I just don't get like how people can support Trump. And like, I get that because I see people sometimes too. And I'm like, why are you, this man is actually diametrically opposed to everything you want. But there is something to be said about the fact that people, I don't want to legitimize like, you know, bad behavior and like bigoted views, but it's not just bigoted views, right? Like there is something to be said about countries that have extreme amounts of inequality and low information, like we do in the US, unfortunately, being prime territory for some idiot like Trump, or maybe I shouldn't call him an idiot, but for some like, you know, babbling crazy bigot like Trump to come and like sweep in and act like he's speaking to those grievances. And so I'm just curious if you could speak to that, because I think that gets lost in this narrative. I mean, first of all, we're not given very many people to choose from. And then second of all, there are people in this country who don't have access to information because all the information is controlled by like a bunch of corporations who keep it very basic and black and white. And we have entire media networks funded to foment hate and stupidity. And in that environment where like people know something's a bit off with this system and it's not really working in their favor, historically, that's when you have the rise of figures like Trump.
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that analysis is exactly right on. I mean, Trump is able to take advantage of like the total failure of the Democratic Party in office, right? The Biden-Harris administration, and also the failure of the Harris campaign to articulate any kind of serious program for the working class. Like, you know, she came out with this, you know, opportunity economy platform, right? Which is like, you know, very highly technical, like, you know, tax credits for X, Y, and Z, and, you know, it would apply to some people, but not to others. Like, there's no like single Harris proposal that working people would get excited about, like rightfully so, right? I mean, she's not for universal health care. She's not for free education. She's you know, not really talking about expanding union rights at all. So yeah, I mean, in the absence of anything, I mean, I think this is also a consequence of the setup of the two-party system, where, you know, the failure of the party in office necessarily benefits the other campaign, even if that campaign actually has exactly the same type of attitude, the same dismissive, arrogant, hostile attitude to working people, like Trump does. You know, here's another piece just to sort of drive that home. Like Trump's main buddy in this final stretch of the campaign has been Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk is like actively going out and buying people's votes, like paying them to sign a petition, right? Which is really paying people to register to vote, and then you get bombarded with text messages. Then you're, you know, essentially you the hope is that you end up throwing Pennsylvania or one of these other swing states to Donald Trump. Like, Elon Musk is a notorious union buster. He has a couple $100 billion, but he's never produced a car in his life. He's never designed, tested, maintained a car. I mean, this is just a guy who got extremely wealthy, exploiting working class people and preventing them from having, you know, preventing his employees from having any kind of like decent standard of living. And this is the guy who Trump wants to put in charge of a quote unquote government efficiency commission. Basically meaning, you know, he would be in charge of cutting social services and laying off public sector workers. So clearly, again, nothing that Trump says will actually address the crises that working people face. But to your point, the way the system is set up, the way the electoral system is set up, and the way that politics in America is just generally structured, leaves some people to believe, either believe that Trump might help them, or just be like, you know what, like, Hail Mary pass, like, I'm really suffering right now, let's just try something different. I think that maybe is actually more common in terms of like the thought process of a person who's deciding to vote for Trump.
You know, Walter, one of the issue that Trump is also cynically exploiting, you know, there's a recent New York Times poll, and I'll just read something from it, and it noted that of the black respondents, it was a poll actually of all black people, 59% said that they thought, quote, we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. 71% of respondents under 30 said that. So obviously there's a lot of people who understand that the war machine is draining resources that could be used right here at home. So I want to ask you this, because since Trump is speaking to it, like on that podcast with Elon Musk, he kept coming back to we have to prevent World War III. I mean, how do you respond to people who say, well, is Trump the more anti-war option?
Sure, yeah, it's an important question. I mean, certainly it's outrageous, and people are outraged that I think it's probably about a couple $100 billion now has been sent from the United States government to Ukraine. A lot of people are, of course, outraged that by some estimates, about $27 billion has been spent supporting Israel's genocide against the people of Gaza, which is now expanded to Lebanon. People are outraged at this, and also just the last 20 plus years of endless war, the 20-year long occupation of Afghanistan, the quagmire of the Iraq War. I mean, people are sick and tired of the war machine and the enormous cost that it places on taxpayers, essentially. Now, Trump's presentation appeals to that, right? Saying like, okay, well, why are we spending all this money? The way he frames it is like helping people abroad when we have problems here at home. The problem with that is that, of course, the actions of the U.S. government on the world stage are not about helping anybody other than Wall Street bankers and Boeing and Lockheed Martin executives. That's the basic problem with that presentation. It's isolationism, not international solidarity. That's what the left, the anti-war movement in this country has always advocated for, right? The unity between working people here in the United States and abroad, the people who are victimized by the same corporations, the same government that oppresses and exploits people here in the United States. We have a lot more in common with them than we do with bankers and CEOs and corporate executives who live in quote unquote our own country. That's the limitation of that approach, even though it speaks to Trump's approach does speak to this very widespread sentiment.
So I think then a lot of people, the question becomes, because I think people tend to view changing the structure, the foundation of the way the U.S. functions is all about just like voting every 4 years. But obviously we're not given very good options in terms of the two people who might actually end up winning. So then what are people to do? I mean, perhaps we should look past electoralism to fix our problems in America. The leading question. It's a very leading question.
Well, you'll be shocked to know that I agree with you. Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, so what has actually led to change in the United States, right? I mean, like how, like what the rights and like social programs and gains that have been won here, as limited as they are, as insufficient as they are, were all won through struggle, right? I mean, the fact that unions are even legal in the first place, the fact that there's Social Security, that Medicare and Medicaid exists, that there is at least some public housing in the United States, not to mention all the political rights, right? Like the end of Jim Crow apartheid. All of that is won through people organizing and taking to the streets and using essentially the power of numbers, the power of the strategic location of working people, the ability to shut production down, right? Like the longshore workers were just able to do a couple of weeks ago on the East Coast. This is where the power to change things really comes from. There are third-party candidates running in the election that have that basic perspective, right? Claudia De La Cruz, Jill Stein, Cornel West. The idea that the only possible or legitimate way to change things is by getting, the right politicians, quote unquote, into office who will just, be nice and help people out. Like that has never, ever led to any change. What happens is that the struggle of people in society changes what's possible, changes what's thinkable. Like, in 2020, I mean, it's a much longer discussion what the, ultimate outcome and results of the wave of protests in 2020 was. But, reparations became like a mainstream issue, at least for a period of time when the protests after the murder of George Floyd broke out. That would have been like, that was unthinkable prior to that. But then it became something that every politician basically had to take a public position on. Like that's the actual way to change the framework in which decisions are made in the United States. And even politicians who would never dream of doing anything progressive can be forced to do that.
No, I think very good points and backed by quite a bit of historical precedent. Well, Walter Smolarek, you are the editor of Liberation News. I know has actually been doing a lot of work recently on the cost of war versus the cost of many things here at home that I think people would like. But as always, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene.
Yep.
I don't know what to add.
Yeah, very comprehensive. I mean, that's Trump is not for you. You think he might be? Unless you're rich. Now, if you're super rich and you're watching, well, first, donate large sums of money to Breakthrough News. But second, yes, he is your candidate. But if you are not super rich, then yeah, not for you.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. And at the end of the day, like 2 weeks from now, we're going to see who wins. It's so neck and neck. It's so close that it's still unclear. But what's crazy is that Trump even has a chance. Like that's what's actually insane to take into consideration, is that this guy even has the chance to win again after everything that's transpired. He's already been president once. He's a disaster of a human being. So it speaks to the fact that, like, if Democrats can't beat him, it speaks to the Democratic's failure, not necessarily, I think, to Trump's successes. But all that's to say, Eugene, I guess let's go ahead and keep moving forward, as you always say. And so for our next guest, we are excited and honored to be joined by Ashish Prashar. He's a political strategist and former advisor to Middle East peace envoy. So Ashish, welcome to the show. It's so good to have you on.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Well, there's a lot to talk about with regard to the genocide taking place in Gaza and Israel's ongoing escalations. And I'm excited to have you on, because you've actually worked in that peace industry before. And I think nothing has demonstrated the absolute failure of the so-called peace and mediation industry more than what we've witnessed over the last year. So I guess, can you talk a little bit about why that's the case? Why is it that all of these massive organizations, these international NGOs, these institutions, and even into an institution like the UN, have been so incapable of not only not doing anything to put a stop to Israel's genocide in Gaza, but also in some cases, they're a part of the problem?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny we're having this discussion on UN Day as we're having this discussion. So this stems all the way back to Iraq for a lot of people. Like, well, if they really want to get into the history of it, Kofi Annan probably was the last outlandish, powerful Secretary General. And, people will see the surface of what went wrong at the UN, the US, and the UK just didn't listen to the Security Council and just invaded illegally. Well, what happened under the surface is a dismantling of all its processes, all its protections, all its strength and power, effectively, that was embodied in the Secretary General's office. I mean, the US and the UK also did a year-long smear campaign on the Secretary General that they appointed to make sure that they could illegally avoid. They had stories about his son taking this and taking that, and blah, blah, blah. They just dismantled Kofi Annan. A lot of his staff publicly have talked about that since then, post his death, how they did everything they can. And what they end up doing is creating institutions that would only benefit the US, the UK, and their allies. The Middle East Peace Envoy's office, the exact office that I worked in. The UN set that up with the UK, Europe, and Russia, and the US. But the whole point of the office was to continue, and I didn't know this at the time, a lot of people who joined it didn't know this, was to continue Israel's kind of expansion, or protect Israel's message as it continued to encroach on the West Bank and Gaza. Even though Gaza was still, sealed off, it was still encroaching on their territory. And what we ended up doing is, just to give you a context of some of the meetings, we would literally go into a meeting with the PA and with Israel, and we'd have some agreed points. We'd walk away, and then the envoy's office would only publish Israel's points. We had documented 2011, 2010, 2012 settler problems. And remember, as you know, they're illegal under the UN mandate. They are this stuff has been going on long before, as you know, way before here. We documented all that stuff. I would argue that some of that's probably been shredded. The UN has basically has done the dereliction of its duty, and it goes way back to when the US and the UK basically butchered its institution to actually hold anyone accountable for anything. If the UN and its body could not protect Iraq, and the US used its funding and other political pressure on the countries not to stop them, I think that was the end of the UN as we know today, as how it functions. And this also spreads beyond that, the ICC. I can't believe we haven't got an arrest warrant, right? So at this point, you have judges and prosecutors who I actually think forget just the institution not working and the cowardice from people not being able to take action against a state that, is actively, openly committing a genocide, not even hiding it, publishing not just photos from soldiers, but also their leaders are saying what they're doing to the public. I mean, this isn't insanity that our institutions can't hold them accountable. But the General Assembly has one thing it can use, and this is the damning thing, and this is where the courage part really plays in. They have an act, effectively, that they can use to take control from the Secretary General, to take control from the Security Council. They could trigger the United Nations Peace Resolution, which basically means the Security Council has failed or it's unable to fulfill its core mandate, which is protecting or maintaining global peace. And the UN General Assembly can call that with 2/3 majority and actually send a peacekeeping troops to Israel without the US, without the UK, without France, frankly, without Russia or China. And the troops are there. The troops are there. We have thousands upon thousands of dedicated peacekeepers who would go there at a heartbeat if given the opportunity to protect the population of Gaza. But no one, even with all their positioning, I think of countries like South Africa, Colombia, because everyone's always like, why is the Middle Eastern countries? I'll forget them for a second because there's politics if Iran did this. But all those countries that have vowed solidarity, all they have to do is propose this and take a vote on it. That's all they have to do and see what happens. Now, if the US ends up saying, hey, if you send them, we're going to defund the US, I'm sure between the rest of the 190 odd countries, they can make up the gap.
Yeah, no, some of them are quite rich too. Wow, wow. I'm honestly just a little stunned because I didn't even know that existed. I mean, everything in the popular mind is like the veto blocks everything. There's nothing that you can do. It's sort of shocking to actually hear that, but I think critically important. So I thank you for that. And I mean, I guess I just wonder, and you spoke to this to some degree, I mean, what do you think is motivating the lack of someone even bringing this up? I mean, is it the pressure behind the scenes, cowardice, combination of both?
Solidarity is interesting to me. I think a lot of people say a lot of stuff, and I'm sure they stand for what they believe in. But, I think the most successful political thing in the last 40 years has been capitalism. Like, their trade links to the US. I mean, South Africa has them too, right? So does Brazil. But the reality is, for me, it's look at the Sahel revolution that's happening right now in West Africa. They've realized, Europe hasn't got a leg to stand on without Africa. Europe doesn't exist without Africa today. And the more that spreads, I believe more of those countries might maintain. I mean, it's going to take too long for Palestine and Lebanon, but the reality is their power is the fact that Europe, less so America produces a lot of its own stuff and obviously drills its own land, but the rest of the Western bloc that supports Israel's onslaught would be crippled tomorrow if West Africa decided to turn the tap off. Would be crippled if South America stopped trading with them. That's all it would take. It would take a day or two, and you'd see markets crash. These countries have so much power. So it makes me also think that they're not willing to take that massive risk to actually change this into a real multipolar world. Even with the BRICS thing going on right now, a lot of those countries play a dual role of working with the US, like India is a great example, and being in the BRICS, right? They're really super connected to these new markets because they don't want to lose the opportunity to trade with them. And they have enough economic power where the US can't punish them for trading with Russia. But they're still going to work with the US, because they don't see that as they see it as a threat to their own economy if they don't. But actually, the reality is, again, I go back to the size of our planet. The US is not the be all and end all. If we have an isolationist president, maybe this will take care of itself in the end of the day. Maybe he doesn't want to trade with the rest of the world. Maybe he does want to make America an island, quite literally in this case. Maybe that will solve it for the rest of the world to get their act together. But the reality is the rest of the world has the power right now to do this, both economically and at the UN. And I think it's basically cowardice that it doesn't allow them. I mean, Colombia has their own problems. You guys know about this. Venezuela, they're constantly being coup attempts and things that the minute they leave the country, a leader there, they will try to do something. So I understand some of the leaders' fear to bring this up. But God, man, South Africa, you brought the ICJ case. The US already hates you, so just do it. Bring this to the UN, bring it to the floor. Let the floor vote and see what happens.
So South Africa, if you're watching, please take but it's a really fair point, and I think it's an important conversation to be having, especially as we see the sort of contradictions of the world lead to more institutions like BRICS, which I know are full of countries with different ideas, and some of them are actually complicit in the genocide, like Egypt and the UAE and the Saudis. I mean, I don't expect them to suddenly, do something materially, although they absolutely could. They just choose not to. But it's important to be asking that question of what everyone should be doing more. And there are countries that have already done a lot. But are they doing enough? Especially as we've seen a year into this, it's still going without any slowing down. And, a part of not slowing it down is the US is really good at playing this game of trickery where they send envoys. Sometimes it's the Secretary of State like Anthony Blinken, who's currently, I think, in Doha. He was in Israel yesterday. Before that, they dispatched Amos Hochstein, the Biden special envoy, who went to Lebanon, and they go under the guise of negotiations. It's just constant negotiations for a potential ceasefire that never happens because these negotiations aren't really diplomacy. I mean, I think you could call them more like gunboat diplomacy, but I'm curious, having worked in the realm of like peace and diplomacy and all these things, what is this game the U.S. is playing and has been playing for the last year where they claim they're working towards a ceasefire? They claim they're trying to bring parties together to negotiate, but actually it's significantly more nefarious than what they claim to be doing.
Right. So the US is trying to give Israel enough runway to finish the job, for lack of a better term, in Gaza. And I think the US is playing this policy from learning from domestic politics, funnily enough, as well, which is they're going to wear us out. The goal is to wear, at least internally, the US population out. Again, I think you mentioned in the previous interview, there's a lack of media, a lack of education in this country. Remember, most people still watch things like Fox and CNN, sadly, and they're getting a different vision of what's happening in Palestine and Lebanon right now, right? We can talk about both Hezbollah and Hamas, who are basically, to most of the world, I always say this, are resistance groups, freedom fighters, to 28 countries. They're called terrorists. Those 28 countries, similarity, are all white settler countries, like effectively countries that colonized half the world, and another one that is a white supremacist nation like the United States. They use that to shape a view, and the reality is that they want to make sure that the population that is actually still cares about this eventually is worn down. The similarities with BLM are very interesting to me. They wear you down with promises of something's going to happen. And right, see, you know how they're going to deliver ceasefire? By basically cleansing Gaza and saying, well, it's over. We've delivered ceasefire, right? That's literally the plan at this point. Blinken has been going there, and I don't think this is even much of a secret, to deal with the day after. He's got private military contracts and contractors willing to go there and police whatever population is left off Gaza and let Israel settle the rest of it. That is the only reason the United States is going there, work on gas fields. This is all the Iraq playbook. The only difference is it took years for us to see what happened in Iraq. It took WikiLeaks. It took amazing journalists to unravel what happened at Abu Ghraib and everything else. But, this is happening in real time. And I think the reason they're pushing so hard before the election to get as much of this done as possible is they don't want to be dealing if Harris wins. They want to say they got what they wanted, which was a pause of violence, whatever they want to call it in the end, by effectively meaning there's no population there to fight back. That's what they're really going for. That will deliver ceasefire in the end. And that's what the US's goal is here, the extermination of everyone, and also setting up a new world order where if you mess with them, this is what's going to happen. I mean, this isn't like a lot of people, we always talk about Holocaust. I want to just skip out. There's been many genocides since the Holocaust. There's genocides before the bloody Holocaust. Most of them happened in countries like in Africa and Asia, so we don't want to talk about them. It didn't affect white people. But, the more recent one that comes to mind is Serbia's genocide in Kosovo and in Bosnia. By the way, Hezbollah sent troops to Bosnia to actually save Bosnians. We should talk about that more often, that a resistance group from Lebanon protected Muslims in Europe from a white fascist Christo organization that wanted to take every last Muslim out. And they were doing similar things to what you're seeing right now. That was happening in Europe. And the reason the US did not intervene, or NATO, while it was happening in its own doorstep, was purely weapons. Again, we talked about this before, the Serbs were getting their weapons, not just from the Russians, they were getting their weapons from military companies that basically were tied to the US as well. But remember, because this was a war happening post-Cold War, so where were they going to make their money? We always had that blip in the 90s where there was no global threat, right, until 9/11. Well, Serbia was that little, we can sell tons of weapons right now and massacre a whole host of people in the process. And we allowed that to happen for so long. And it took, frankly, constant people, Joe Biden also made a speech about that. If people aren't familiar, everyone talks about his anti-apartheid speech when he was running to be president in '88, where he was like, oh, how could you let people be under apartheid? He was running to win the black vote. But if you look at the speech he made about Bosnia, He was talking about war crimes on both sides, but he again, the playbook is the same. But the Bosnians, they rape. The Bosnians, they're Muslim. Our people don't do that, right? That's the difference. And that's why we don't get involved, and the playbook is identical. But I want to go back to the thing about like the cowardice element of this. I think this is the most important thing, right? Right now, the only thing saving people in Palestine and Lebanon, and you know this better than me, obviously being Lebanese, like is literally the resistance. And I think people don't realize that while our institutions are failing us, they are literally protecting humanity for what the ruling class wants next. Not just like Lebanon and Palestine. They're literally protecting humanity. And I think more officials actually believe that than people realize in the realms of the United Nations, maybe, but not in the US. The State Department is all aboard this, right? I worked for a Blair administration in the UK where one person chose to resign back in when we illegally invaded, the Foreign Secretary, Robin Cook at the time. We don't have men of character like that anymore in our governments. They are all aboard the genocide train. They don't care what happens to the people of Gaza or Palestine or Lebanon. They're in bed with this. And people looking to the next administration, whether it be Harris or Trump, to solve for this, the war machine's too valuable for everybody right now. The only thing, I think what your previous guest mentioned about the MAGA anti-war movement, that's very real, by the way. But I think it will immediately affect Ukraine. They'll save billions of dollars doing that and continue to let Israel do what it's doing. It'll look like they're anti-war, right? They'll do the whole immediate, like, we'll just pull all funding from Ukraine, save hundreds of millions and billions. So that way he looks anti-war to that radical, that base of his that a lot of vets are in, by the way, that don't want this. But what we need right now, Rania, is a new international order that creates its own terror watch list, that creates its own court to hold people accountable. And not just for today's sins, for colonial sins, right? Too often, we have the French and the British weighing in on this alongside the United States. The French, by the way, who still, today, if the UN was functioning, would be bankrupt because they take most of their wealth from West Africa still today. They still do the Haiti model on West Africa, where they have to deposit their money in a French bank and have to loan it back at French consumer interest rates. They indebt West African countries with their own resources. If the UN was functioning, that would be illegal. Like, they wouldn't be on the Security Council. We need to not dissolve the UN. It needs to be reformed. But what we need to do is build other institutions around it. We need an ICC that reflects the rest of the world, the global south. We need an ICJ that reflects the global south and its needs and its and the justice that should be served on the things that the US companies and arms institutions are doing, as well as the US government. And we need, frankly, our own terror watch list of people like Joe Biden, Antony Blinken, and every other fascist leader in Europe right now that's perpetrating these crimes. The irony, and I use that word fascism, is the only one who's instituted an arms embargo is Meloni. And she's probably arguably the most public fascist.
Jesus.
Yeah. No, it is deeply ironic. Well, we really appreciate you joining us, Ashish Prashar. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, all fantastic points, and just shows you how undemocratic a world we live in, Eugene.
Indeed.
Just like incredible when you think about like what he was saying about 28 nations classify Hamas as a terrorist organization. That's in a world of how many nations? Actually, it's like 160 or something.
Like maybe 60.
Oh, sorry, I just added nations. I don't know.
It's
a lot more than
more
28.
Than 28.
Significantly more countries in the world than 28. And yet these 28 countries that just like survive off of the rape and theft of resources from Africa, Asia, and Latin America get to run the world. It's really incredible.
Indeed. Well, tectonic plates perhaps shifting. Many people talking about that now since the BRICS summit has been happening in Russia this week. And to get into all of the things surrounding this, we are very honored to be joined here by Roger McKenzie, who is the international editor of the Morning Star newspaper, a longtime anti-racist organizer. And I say long time, even though he's still a very young man, and also an executive member of the Communist Party of Britain. Roger, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Everything was great apart from the young bit. That was
there's a lot to be said, I guess, about the BRICS summit. I mean, it's an interesting commentary maybe on the world. I mean, also happening this week is the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa. And I think two of the largest countries in the Commonwealth, South Africa and India, their presidents are actually in Russia at the BRICS summit. So in and of itself, I think, maybe 30 or 40 years ago, that would never be the case where we are now. So, I mean, I guess looking at this, Roger, I mean, how much, does this represent, a sea change in sort of geopolitics and global relations, and how much more is there left to be done, I guess, in that context as well. I think there's both the sort of positive element and the contradictions as well.
The thing with the Commonwealth heads thing, I get this vision in my head of all these colonialists sitting around a little round table, kind of carving up the world and stuff. And the problem is they probably think that they still are. That's the problem. And that they still have this kind of old mentality. But what we've seen this week in Kazan, I think is a really important moment in the world. I mean, we're kind of used to everything being instant and things happening real quick. I think we've got to get used to the idea that we're on a longer term project here. So I think a lot of people say, no, we're going to see, kind of real decisions made that are going to de-dollarize and all this sort of stuff. Well, I think we're seeing real small steps being taken to consolidate BRICS, to bring in the right partners, to make sure that things are working properly, that the new members of BRICS feel welcomed and understand the way that the organization works around consensus and stuff. And I think that's all really, really important. We've also seen, incidentally, something really important over the last couple of days, and that we've seen Saudi Arabia finally confirm that they're not a member of BRICS, and that it looks as though they're still going to take some part. And we have to imagine or kind of educatedly guess, I suppose, that the United States put some kind of pressure on the Saudis not to be a part of BRICS. But nevertheless, what we've seen is a whole bunch of new partner countries coming in. Really importantly for me, Cuba as one of those new partners. But we've also seen Vietnam. We've seen a whole range of different African countries. So Uganda, which provides a link, across East Africa, along with Ethiopia, and with Ethiopia already being a member. We've got North Africa, so you've already got Egypt as a member, and now you've got as a partner, you've got Algeria. So we're seeing some big moves here, and I think that it's the right move that the existing members of BRICS are consolidating, are making sure that the direction that they need to go is the right one, that it looks as though they're going to, that they're extending the term of office of Delma Russo as the chair of the BRICS Bank, if you like. And I think that's really important as well, to provide some continuity there. So I think what we've got from this week is a really big moment in terms of where the global majority is at. The fact that we've got massive, ancient civilizations, so Persian civilization through Iran. We've got Russian civilization. We've got the Egyptian civilization. We've got Indian civilization. We've got all of these civilizations coming together, that I think is going to make a real difference. And, we've got the West, the former colonial powers, who can only just sit and watch as this takes place, and there's nothing they can do about it. The genie's out of the bottle, and these changes are going to bring about real changes in the world, I think.
Roger, we've definitely covered the rise of BRICS and the sort of like growing multipolarity that we're seeing the world move towards on this show many times. But I think a lot of people probably have questions like what I'm about to ask you, which is, okay, this is all happening within the context of a very different world than last year, because since last year, we've had you on to talk about this before. There's been the genocide in Gaza, which has now expanded to Lebanon, which could expand to Iran as Israel tries to escalate. The US and Israel try to escalate with Iran and potentially go to war there. Yemen is being bombed. Sometimes Iraq is bombed. And it just seems like the neocons in the US are fulfilling many of their wildest dreams at the moment. Imperialism, US-led imperialism, has never been more depraved or vicious than what we've witnessed for the past year. And it just feels like the rest of the world is either unable to do anything to throw a wrench in it, or unwilling, whether it's fear of the US, whether it's because these, there's a lot of countries in the global south that are complicit with the US and are complicit with Israel, some of whom are in BRICS. And now new members of BRICS, right? So I guess the question becomes, how are we, and this is more like a devil's advocate question, but I guess I kind of feel it too these days, is how are we supposed to be encouraged by any sort of multipolarity that might come about in the distant future when we need something to get in the way of a Holocaust right now, and there doesn't seem to be any power there at all? Like, the US seems to be more hegemonic than it has ever been. At least that's how it feels.
The power that I've seen in recent times that's brought about any shift in the politics in terms of the genocide around Gaza has been brought about by the people, not by governments, it seems to me. Some governments have kind of shifted. I think the point was made by your previous guest about how even kind of openly fascist Maloney has decided to stop arms going to the Israelis, but nobody else has. Other people have kind of yapped about it and done nothing. We've got really, lots of fine kind of speeches being made. Right? You need to look at the UN a few weeks ago and some of the speeches that were being made, but nobody's doing anything. So that leads me to the conclusion, Rania, that we have to do what we've always done as a people, which is rely on each other and build the movements ourselves, build on what we've had in terms of the anti-war movements, but also something more than that. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking before I came on really was about, do we really want to just continue putting, we might have some politicians in the BRICS now who we've got some respect for and we think might do something eventually sometime, and that's all fine. They might do something. But I'm much more comfortable with putting my faith and my organising kind of efforts in with people who are prepared to build movements, not just in their own countries, but across the globe. Now, you could just leave BRICS to develop over that longer term period, as I think it will, and hopefully it develops in a proper way, although I think there's going to be some real obstacles along the way when you look at some nations like India who are part of this, and UAE and so on. I think there's some built-in obstacles already within there. But I think that what we have is an opportunity to build our own movement to put pressure on BRICS. And I think so for me, we need to be looking at what more we can do to build that worldwide movement of progressive forces, for me, communist, socialist forces that are gonna really push these politicians to do something. I mean, when I first started getting involved in politics, all those years ago, Eugene says I'm young, I wish, all those years ago was I was told that the only way politicians ever move is if there's heat under them to move. And I think we have to create that heat, not just in our own countries, but across the globe. So I'm really interested in looking at what is it that we can do to build on the progressive movements that exist, not just within the BRICS nations and the kind of partner nations, but in like the belly of the beast as well. Like in the United States, in Britain, so politicians can't get away with nice, easy kind of comments that, yeah, of course we're against genocide, and then nothing happens. The only way anything will happen with those politicians is if we force it to happen. So I'm really interested in that sort of discussion about how we can build that movement to put pressure on these politicians. But actually, anyway, I think it's something that is absolutely necessary at this time. I'm not in favour of somebody else deciding my future. Actually, I'm much more in favour of sitting down with fellow activists and designing our future ourselves. So I think it's in our hands and not politicians who we can't reach and who are seemingly not prepared to listen and certainly not to do anything about the genocide that's taking place at the moment.
No, I think those are all really important points, and point to the fact that it's kind of a two-way street in a way. I mean, if we want to see different things happen, to the extent there's movement from the global south, good, but let's not cut off our own knees here. Let's try to get some movement in the global north, so it's not just one group of people who are out there. Let me just ask you this quickly, a couple more minutes before we close, Roger. I mean, the significance in many ways of more African countries, not just joining BRICS. I mean, there's a lot of contradictions in Africa, but just being more at the center of the global conversation, whether we're talking about joining BRICS, what's happening in the Sahel, the South African ICJ case. I mean, what does it mean for the next, let's say, 20 years to have Africa, or what should it mean? What could it mean? What hopefully will it mean more at the center of the global conversation?
Well, funny you should ask that question, because my next book is going to be is about that very subject. Because for me, what we're seeing at the moment is I think the unstoppable rise of the African nations at the moment. But again, that won't just happen. Because there will be a kickback from the colonial powers. They're not just going to allow this stuff to take place and just say, well, tough, we've been beaten this time. That's just not the way they operate. We all know that. What they will do is there will be a reaction. And again, we have to be organized enough to be able to support those countries. But I do think that when you look at the Sahel, when you look at the way that certainly the BRICS as a bloc has recognized the importance of Africa at last, actually. So I was a bit kind of surprised that there weren't more African nations in the first tranche of new nations coming in, but now we're getting more. And when you look at the strategic nature of those groups, it's about creating trade corridors. It's about creating links for those countries. So it's not just a randomly done thing. But for me, this is about a great, there's like so many great African civilizations that many people in the global north, in the belly of the beast where we both, we three are, who don't understand how all of those great civilizations have played a massive role in carrying things forward across the world. But also, as well, it's about the resources that those nations have as well, and having more control over the resources that Africa has, so it's not continued to be portrayed as a poor, struggling continent, but actually has more control over the resources that it's there. And frankly, I think your earlier guest made the point: without Africa, then the rest, the West is done,
Mm-hmm.
And I think having those resources available to build Africa, I think, is vital. So I want to play a role in supporting that from where we are across the diaspora. And sometimes we just talk about Africa as being on the continent, and I'm involved in enough organizations as well that are looking to see how we can support what's taking place on the African continent, on Mother Africa, from places like Britain and the United States. And I think that's an exciting time, but it's going to be a difficult time because there will be a kickback. The United States isn't just going to allow that to happen.
Absolutely. Well, as always, very enlightening. Always enjoy talking to you. Roger McKenzie, international editor of the Morning Star, amongst many other superlatives. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks, guys. Take care.
Well, Rania, I just want to get right into it to our next guest, which I have to say I'm very, very excited. I think a number of us saw when King Charles was recently in Australia, a brave senator stood up to raise many of the issues around genocide, colonialism, and many other things. And we are very honored to have with us here Senator Lidia Thorpe, who is a Gunnai, Gunditjmara, Djab young woman and a senator from the Australian state of Victoria, all-around hero to many of us. Senator, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for the invitation, brother. It's an absolute honor. And thank you, sister. Amazing.
No, it really is amazing to have you. And I guess I just want to start here. I mean, I think maybe there's a lot of people who sort of maybe generally have some sense of what was visited on the First Peoples, the crimes of, what we now call Australia. But maybe just give some context to the brutality, because I think people kind of treat it as like a side issue. Maybe it wasn't genocidal. Maybe these things were just not that important. Why are we talking about them in 2024? What is some of that history and contemporary reality that moved you to let the king know how you felt?
Well, there was a war declared on our people in this country by the colonizer. They came with guns. They buried our babies in the ground and kicked their heads off. They committed mass murder. They brought disease. Their purpose was to wipe us out. And that was over 200 years ago. Now, my people resisted from the very first moment that they set foot on these shores, and we've resisted ever since. I am part of that resistance. My family's part of that resistance. And, I'm a product of the activism that's been, constantly calling out colonisation, calling it genocide, calling for a treaty, and maintaining that we are the sovereign people of these lands. You can't have a king of some other country come and say that they're sovereign to these lands. To be sovereign, you must be of the land. You must be connected through the sky and through our totems, the animals and the trees and the water. If you're not connected to those things, then you can't just rock up to someone else's country and say that you're sovereign. So, he's taken on responsibility of the Crown, which has caused a lot of harm to our people and our land here. And the audacity for him to sit up there and say a few nice things about our people in this country was inappropriate, and it was insulting. And he needed to be sent a clear message from my ancestors and from my old people, because, I attend funerals upon funerals. I'm getting community calling out, mothers crying out, saying that their babies are still being taken. We got 24,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in this country that are being taken from their mothers. We have over 600 deaths in custody, much more that's not recorded because they don't record babies that die in custody when their mothers are being imprisoned and brutalised. So 600 deaths with not one person ever held responsible. Our suicide rate is off the charts. The land desecration and water theft here is still a very real issue. And he needed to know that. And my grandmother, my 90-year-old grandmother, is very proud of me. And I don't care what other people say. I've done the right thing by my grandmother, who's, fought all her life. And I have a responsibility to my ancestors and my old people to maintain that resistance.
Mm-hmm. You're going to make me cry. I think we're all proud of you. I mean, you said words that so many people around the world resonates with them. And obviously everything you're talking about is a situation for Indigenous people in so many ways, similar ways that you referenced in Canada, in the United States, and beyond. But these three places in particular are some of the most vicious and sadly successful settler colonies. And, they've done a really good job of erasing their atrocities, as well as pretending like the remnants of their atrocities aren't continuing today. So I really appreciate what you did, and I appreciate you bringing it to the present of what your people are still having to contend with. And, you know, you've also been very outspoken on the issue of Palestine, which King Charles and the Australian government and the US government and the Canadian government and all the European governments that are responsible for destroying so much of the world have been supporting. And, you know, I think I've seen a lot of people say that watching, because it's live streamed for the first time, we're witnessing like a genocide be live streamed, and including by the people perpetrating it. So we're seeing their behavior. And so a lot of people who've studied slavery, who've studied the genocide of the indigenous people across the world, they've read about this sort of thing, but they're seeing Gaza and they're like, wow, now you're kind of seeing this come to life because it's happening in front of your eyes and you witness how it happens. And so I'm just curious, as somebody who's been outspoken on this issue, how do you relate to what you see happening in Gaza?
Oh, it just gave me goosebumps, sister, because that's our, you know, we have Palestinian brothers and sisters and families who are going, as you say, live stream. We're seeing a genocide unfold around the globe. We know what that's like, you know. We know the effects of genocide. We are the survivors of genocide. And it is what happened to us. It is what continues to happen to us in the most sophisticated fashion. And I'm down at those rallies for Palestine on Sundays, and I am guided by Palestinian family on, you know, on all things Palestine. But basically they want self-determination. We want self-determination. We want land back. They want land back. We want the end to the genocide. They want the end to the genocide. Their families are just like my families. You know, I've sat with many families and I'm like, you're just like us. We talk about land. We talk about, you know, our stories as indigenous people who are under constant attack and being profiled on the streets. Even here, you know, Palestinian people are being profiled. They're seen to be troublemakers with all the rallies, yet the Nazis can come on in and others and disrupt and not held accountable. So there's one rule for one group of people still in this country and one rule for another. And the heavy-handed colonial police, you know, they attack black and brown people in this country. And so I stand with Palestinians. We're fighting the same fight, and we're trying to keep our people alive. And so I'll continue to call out the parliament here. I constantly protest in the parliament and call out Palestine. They made a new law that you couldn't say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Well, I scream that out every day in the chamber just to make the point that they can't shut me down, not for my people and not for Palestinians, and I'll stand there till the day that I leave.
And, you know, Senator, I think that's such an important point, and it brings me to another issue that I have a feeling is maybe misrepresented. But what we've seen from, you know, certainly the current Australian government, you know, others in Parliament, sort of, we saw the indigenous voice referendum and other things. The perception they're giving to the world, to those of us in the United States, is very much, oh, we're bringing in Aboriginal people, we're giving people more of a voice, we're becoming more representative, and, you know, so love us because look how great and diverse we are, and then of course bring your tourism here because all the things you might be concerned about aren't an issue. I mean, how much of this is smoke and mirrors, and how much is real sort of change in governance there?
Whilst there's an ongoing sophisticated genocide against my people, that it is false, and it is smoke and mirrors. It's lying. And we are Australia's dirty little secret in this country. And I've just exposed that for what it is. Their occupation is illegitimate. We don't have a treaty. And they'll pull out their, you know, assimilated Aboriginal people when they so choose, but they take no action for justice. No action. No action on child stealing. No action on missing and murdered black women in this country. No action on the jails that are full of our people. We lock up 10-year-olds in this country for stealing a chocolate bar. And then they have a morning tea with the Prime Minister and they pick out the blackfellas that, aren't going to rock the boat or question the authority and portray to the rest of the world that we're all happy little Vegemites in the lucky land of Oz. Well, we're not. And my people are dying and I've had enough. My people have had enough and we're calling it out for what it is. And Australia is guilty of crimes against humanity, of our people and other brown people in this country.
Well, Senator, I have to say, you've flown the flag for so many people around the world. I think indigenous people and African descended people in particular, also the Arab world and everywhere that's suffering under this same history of this crown and lacking justice, but building movements to fight back. And we really just thank you. I know it's, I think, very early in the morning there. So I really appreciate you giving us some of your time and coming on to chat with us.
Power to you all. We can win this fight when we are together. Thank you, brother. Thank you, sister.
Right on.
Thank you. Wow, what an incredible, incredible person.
Amazing.
Hero.
Yeah, absolute hero. When I saw this happen, I was like, yes, get him. Like, because it's like these things are so sanitized and it's so ridiculous. And I thought the point she made at the beginning of saying a few words, because, now the British royal family is all about being like, well, we know that it wasn't always good or whatever, but we're not going to do anything about it. So to see her get out there and just make it happen.
Back, or give anything we stole back.
And that's big.
But also, I mean, she literally just hearing her talk about her grandmother being proud of her actually almost like made me start to tear up. Like I don't cry easily, guys. And that just made me almost cry. So power to her and power to all the people around the world who are, because, it's also hard. Like, I'm glad that you asked her that question about like the sort of the fact that Australia tries to sell itself as like, no, like we're good now. We have like indigenous people representing, because Canada does the same thing. The US sort of does it, not as much actually. The US doesn't do it as much. They do it with other minorities, but not so much with Native Americans. But they do try a little bit, not to the same extent. But all that's to say, it's all fake. It's all whitewashing. None of these countries have given reparations, have given land back, and no one's ever paid for any crimes. And the crimes are still happening.
Yes.
That's the other thing. Still happening. So that was the best. That was the best thing I've seen all week was her yelling at King Charles.
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. I think it just gave so many people life all around the world, to see something happen. And the thing I'll say is, to make your point about how it's still happening and they're not doing anything, they asked Sir Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, or his Prime Minister.
Okay, can I just say real quick, become a patron. No, become a patron, and Eugene will do a British accent every single show for at least 5 seconds.
If you give over $1,000,
you're so whatever, man. That's
I'm trying to keep this network going, Rania. But
I was trying to get patrons, but okay. All right.
Anyway, long story short, is the guy tried to evade it. They asked us, it actually wasn't Keir Starmer, now that I remember, it was his aide. And he tried to kind of evade it at first, and then they kind of asked him the question again. And he's like, well, let me just be clear. We do not pay reparations. And I'm like, well, there you go.
Thank you for being honest.
It was like Germany, and then we'll move on to our next guest. This issue came up last year of the genocide of the Herero people in Namibia. And they made kind of like a half fake apology because they were afraid, this was the reporting that was coming out, they were afraid to make a full apology because then they could be held accountable by international institutions and possibly made to pay reparations. So they couldn't even just like rhetorically acknowledge this terrible genocide that involved many different things, but including sending thousands and thousands of people into the desert to starve to death. But, they don't even want to talk about it. But anyway, we can keep talking about this.
Sorry, before you go to our next guest, since we're on Germany, I just want to note the German foreign minister came to Lebanon yesterday. And you know what she said in Lebanon? That Lebanese people are all human shields for Hezbollah.
Wow. Well, she also said it was okay to kill civilians in Lebanon, I believe, and also in Palestine.
And Gaza.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Barcock, or whatever her name is. She's the worst. I mean, well, if they're there, then the civilians are like, who are you? I mean,
A Nazi. She's a
yeah,
Nazi.
well,
That's who she is.
look, and as we know, they didn't do anything to denazify. Sorry, I have to pour some water here.
No.
They did nothing to denazify
Well,
West
Nazi
Germany,
Guys,
and the only
Nazis
place
won.
they did,
Nazis
East
actually
Germany,
won.
they got
Yeah.
rid of it. So anyway, long
Nazis-
story short, and that's the Green Party, by the way, of Germany. But anyway,
Incredible.
don't get me started on German politics now. Let's actually turn to another critically important issue, and that is Cuba, which is experiencing some very difficult circumstances right now, but they are not exactly just random. There's a lot behind it, and by a lot, I mean the United States government. To talk more about this, we are very honored to be joined by Manolo de los Santos, who is, among many other superlatives I could list, the co-executive director of the People's Forum and a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Manolo, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me on again.
Well, listen, it's there is no other choice to talk about this because I think there's so much misinformation here. I mean, Cuba's been going through extreme blackouts, and the way that it's often presented is this is just the long-term mismanagement of socialism, that there's just nothing else that's going on. So without me editorializing too much, I mean, what is behind the blackouts that we've seen in Cuba?
Well, for the U.S. government, it's always so easy to deny any responsibility at all, to say that Cuba is a failed state and somehow never admit that its sanctions have any impact on the Cuban economy and on the Cuban people. What's been happening is, in fact, not a story of this past week, but actually a story of the past few years, which is that since Trump put in place a series of sanctions that specifically target Cuba's ability to import fuel, and not just fuel, but even the opportunity to import spare parts for its electrical grid, that electrical grid has severely deteriorated to the point that it needs massive, and I would say almost billionaire repairs to a system in order to continue operating. Add to this that since Cuba was added to the state sponsors of terrorism list by Trump at the very end of his administration, literally in January as he was about to leave the White House, it has also meant that Cuba is not allowed to make the majority of its financial transactions with banks around the world in order to even try to purchase these fuels or spare parts on other markets. Meaning the perfect storm was created so that sooner or later, like it did last week, Cuba would be caught in a situation where its electrical grid, under high demand because of the extreme weather of these past few months in Cuba, would be forced to crash. And, there are many grids around the world that are facing this similar situation in Nigeria, in Puerto Rico, in many other parts of the world. But only in Cuba are the hands of the government literally tied to their backs, being prevented from being able to solve this problem with normal measures. Cubans instead have to resort to their ingenuity, to their creativity, to basically reformulate with the parts that they already have a solution for this national grid. And after 3.5 days of severe blackout, the Cubans brought the national grid back on. But the larger question remains, which is, how long can Cuba continue to sort of make small repairs to this national electrical grid when they are not able to make the necessary repairs that are impeded by the US blockade and these vicious sanctions that Trump put in place, but Biden has kept all these years after?
Yeah, I think the irony is the way that the U.S. frames this as, it's just the mismanagement of socialism, when actually it's capitalism. It's American capitalism, American imperialism is what's doing this. And I think it's hard for people sometimes to wrap their heads around what you're explaining, because this is why sanctions can be effective in that narrative, because they take time, especially when it comes to infrastructure decay. And I remember when I was looking into the electricity infrastructure of Syria and how it's just completely deteriorated over the last 10 years, specifically because of US sanctions. It's like electricity infrastructure, power plants, they need constant spare parts all the time. You have to have like a constant backup of everything, because everything is always breaking and needs to be replaced because there's such high demand on that sort of infrastructure. And so if you can't constantly get in these spare, like parts of machines you've never even heard of, right? It's like, it's eventually going to fail. And I want to ask you also, Manolo, because Cuba, of course, putting them on the state sponsor of terrorism list, and then also the added sanctions under Trump that Biden kept intact, in addition to the blockade Cuba's already subjected to for over 60 years. On top of that, there's sanctions on Venezuela that have impacted Cuba, because if I'm not mistaken, Venezuela used to give fuel to Cuba. So that's like a secondary way that sanctions hurt Cuba. Could you talk a little bit about that aspect of this as well? Though I'm not sure if that contributed specifically to this outage, but it does impact Cuba's ability to access fuel.
But I think you bring a very important point, Rania, which is we're not just talking about the sanctions or the blockade against Cuba. We're actually living in a world where the US sanctions a third of the countries on the planet, and that affects all of the countries involved. Because ultimately, if the sanctions by the US were only limited to US companies, you could say, well, countries like Cuba or Syria or Venezuela or Zimbabwe then have other opportunities to trade with other countries. But the reality is that all these sanctions placed by the US are internationally applied by what, in my opinion, is a rogue state called the United States. I mean, these are extraterritorial applications of US law, to the point that I have a very recent experience. I just was hearing from colleagues in Cuba where they were purchasing spare parts, for example, from a French company that was going to ship spare parts for Cuba's electrical grid, but that halfway as they were being shipped to Cuba, they were stopped. The ship was turned around because the US literally had to tell the French company that one of the spare parts had a small percentage of US components and therefore could not be sold to Cuba.
Oh, man.
This applies to the ships that Cuba uses to apply to buy fuel for its national grid. Many times coming from Venezuela. Venezuela and Cuba are not that far apart physically, but even ships between Venezuela and Cuba are sanctioned literally from doing that trade. So we live in a world where we're going to have to create an alternative system that we really hope is born out of BRICS, out of a new multipolarity, but that effectively challenges the US rogue state rule of disorder and impose terror on the people of the world. I mean, imagine a world in which not just the Cuban people, but millions of people on the planet are subject to the whims of the Department of Treasury and OFAC.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Manolo, I think one of the other factors here is that even in the context of the blackout and all these other challenges, the sort of broader Cuban revolutionary process was not inert. I mean, like, obviously, I'm glad you mentioned Nigeria. You know, the power's off all the time, and the government is just like, oh, sorry, hope it works out for you next time. But, I think I want you to talk a little bit about what we saw, the forms of social solidarity, the different pieces that emerged in Cuba, and that kind of, I hate to even say like the government, like sort of like the merging of the sort of the people's aspirations and the governmental apparatus that can kind of spring into action. And even if it's not 100% adequate, can at least try to meet people's needs as much as you can under very difficult circumstances.
Well, I think this is where the US always makes the worst and wrongest assumptions about Cuban reality, is that they assume that under their maximum pressure campaign, which is, in every way, shape, or possible designed to basically make the Cuban economy collapse, to make Cuban society, the social fabric of Cuban society, collapse. The reality is that the Cuban people are highly resilient and highly united. They have a sense of purpose, which for over 2 centuries has been defined by fighting for their ultimate and total independence from the US, from Spain, from any empire that tries to take over Cuba. And, immediately the response throughout Cuba was that the neighbors responded in an organized fashion. Those who could provide wood to make fire, to cook, did so. Pots and pans were brought out to make, meals for their neighbors. Whoever did have, a little shred of electricity at the hospitals or at certain institutions immediately shared it so that people could charge their phones and charge their other apparatuses. I mean, no one was left abandoned. And I think one of the things that Cuban society is well known for is that, it has such an incredible response to disaster system. In the middle of all this severe blackout, a Hurricane Oscar, hit Cuba, eastern Cuba, particularly the provinces of Guantanamo and Holguin. And you would think that how would a country be able to respond to this when they have no electricity? There's no way to communicate any information by television or by radio. And the reality is that the Cuban civil defense was up and running. Sadly, 7 people died as a result of the hurricane, but hundreds of thousands of lives were saved because people were still able to be evacuated. Their goods and their homes were saved. And greater disaster was averted. But this is a result of Cuba not necessarily having an unlimited amount of resources. What it has is unlimited capacity to take care of people, and that's based on its human resources.
Manolo, I think it's really important during a moment like this when just so much harm is being done to this country or that area or this area to recognize that there's a pattern here in who's carrying out these atrocities. And you've often done this, and I think it's important to do it. You'll connect what's happening in Cuba to what's happening in Gaza. I mean, obviously, they're very different things, but they're also not so dissimilar because it's the same forces that are stacked against them. So I'm just curious if you can explain how it's basically the same enemy there.
Well, I always like to point out that the history of the United States, the history of colonialism, the history of its becoming an imperialist power have been based on genocide. Genocide is part of the DNA of American government and American society. And it has extended this genocidal approach to life, to dealing with the difference in others, to dealing with literally the other through war and extermination, to death and destruction. We see it in Gaza, where people were kept under siege, under a blockade, under sanctions for years for simply having what the US considered was the wrong government. They shouldn't have elected the wrong government. The Cubans have had to pay for that same crime of electing and having their own government chosen by them, but happens to be the wrong one according to the US for over 60 years now. But these are not exceptional cases. This is, in fact, the rule. This is the norm that the US has been trying to impose on the world, almost as a tale to tell others. If you go down the path of independence, if you choose and try to make your own determinations as a country, as a people, you will pay the full price. And the price is there for everyone to see. The price of freedom is called Gaza, and the price of freedom is called Cuba. And we're in a moment in history where there is a uprising, a global uprising for justice, for liberation. We have a responsibility as part of that global uprising to say all sanctions and blockades must end now, because they go against our basic human dignity. I mean, to hear of the Palestinian students who are on scholarship in Cuba right now, when you hear their stories about how they grew up under siege in Gaza and what it is to be medical students in Cuba under siege now, you see the harrowing similarities. But you also see just an incredible identification and sympathy in their capacity to fight. Neither the people of Gaza nor the people of Cuba have given up. They have chosen that freedom is more precious than anything else. And for that, they're willing to live out the consequences of these sanctions. But that means then that the people in the United States have a deep responsibility to transform this reality, because it is on us. How long are we going to allow the people of Gaza and the people of Cuba to simply suffer under US sanctions? We have to end this now. And we've actually put a message out directly to President Biden saying, on Cuba, you have literally 90 days left in your administration to take Cuba off the state sponsors of terrorism list. It's a simple review that can be done on your simple stroke of a pen. The time is now. There's no valid reason to keep Cuba on that list. With that alone, it would be a huge change in Cuba's situation and its ability to respond to natural disasters and to this severe energy crisis.
Mm-hmm. Well, real quick before we let you go, Manolo, on that point, I know that you all at the People's Forum are organizing various different points to assist the Cuban people in this difficult humanitarian situation. Well, I guess there it is on the bottom of the screen. I was going to say, where do people go to learn more? But say more about the efforts people will find if they go to the address there that we see on the screen.
Well, at the People's Forum, we're going to continue to advocate loudly and very publicly to take Cuba off this list. But we also feel it's a huge responsibility at this moment to send material aid. I mean, Cuba's facing this triple threat of a blockade, a severe energy crisis, and a hurricane. So we wanted to respond by sending urgently needed power generators, sending urgently needed food and other supplies, medicine, everything that could be used to relieve the Cuban people, particularly in the hardest hit province of Guantanamo. Now, we have joined with the Hatue Project and with the Party for Socialism and Liberation to launch a fundraiser that now has a stated goal of 100,000, but we know we can raise more because we feel that the people of the United States and people around the world feel sympathy for the Cuban people. They are our brothers and sisters, so we know we can raise more than $100,000. But all of this is already going to support the Cuban people. Already, right now, we have a plane being filled with power generators. We just need your help to get it to the finish line and to get more on their way in the next few days.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Manolo de los Santos, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, that was a very important and full show. Once again, taking everyone around the world.
Indeed, indeed. And we really appreciate everyone coming. On the way out, Rania, what do you hope people know, or what do they need to know in terms of our platform?
Oh, well, they need to know that they should have smashed that like button. I forgot to antagonize our audience. If you
like
button. Thank you. Yeah, make sure you do that. It helps boost us in the algorithm. Make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News on all social media platforms and that you're sharing our content because that's how people will see it. More importantly, or most importantly, I should say, if you are able to, please consider becoming a Breakthrough News member by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News, where you can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merchandise for as little as $5 a month, though we don't cap how much you should give. But also it's this is a moment in time when independent media is more important than ever, bringing the reality of the world to people who are just being, force-fed CNN and the New York Times. We're a good antidote to that. So consider helping us sustain our journalism and helping us grow by becoming a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News.
Mm-hmm. Well, big thanks to all of our guests. Big thanks to all of you who viewed it. And of course, shout out, as always, to the whole Breakthrough News team that makes this show possible, and also our friends at Free Speech TV that make it possible to come to you there on their platform. For myself, for Rania, for us at Breakthrough, we will see you next time.